Wicked. Thanks very much for having me. So I'm Rob. I am Chief Toaster at Toast Ale. And I'm from Tunbridge, so thanks for letting the riffraff into Tunbridge Wells for the night. Really appreciate it. I'll get out as quick as I can. Born and raised in Tunbridge, and then tried to escape, buggered off to London for a little bit, and then came crawling back, tail between my legs when we expected our first child. And absolutely love it. And so Toast Ale, we're on a mission to prove that the alternative to food waste is freaking delicious and indeed pint-sized. So as Catherine said, we turn bread that would otherwise go to waste into what is now an award-winning beer, and basically with a slice of bread in every bottle. There's a slice in there somewhere, and 100% of our profits poured into charity. We think we're the best thing since you know what. And so this whole thing really started 2 years ago, when at the time I was running an organization called Ashoka, and Ashoka supports social entrepreneurs, so people that have innovative solutions to social or environmental problems, helping to take those ideas to scale, providing funding and support, strategic ideas and advice to help ideas really go to scale. And one of the social entrepreneurs within our network was a guy called Tristram Stewart, a good friend of mine, and Tristram is a real food waste advocate, campaigner, he's a best-selling author, a real kind of guru of all things food waste, and arguably more than anyone, he's done more to raise awareness about food waste. And he'd just come back from a trip to Brussels where he'd tried a beer that had been brewed with bread, and the beer was called Babylon. It's called Babylon because the first ever beer that's ever been brewed and the first ever recipe that's been discovered from 5,000 years ago was a beer that was brewed with bread, and for thousands of years, that's how bread was made. That's how beer was made, rather. And so he came back from this trip to Brussels and was kind of having a chat with me and was like, Rob, you know the biggest food waste in the world? It's bread. So 44% of the bread that's baked in the UK goes to waste. It's absolutely bonkers. 1/3 of the food that we produce in the world goes to waste. Over 1 billion tons of food every single year around the world goes to waste. And the biggest culprit of them all, the worst offender, is the humble loaf of bread. And so Tristram was kind of having a chat with me and saying, Rob, why don't we start up a beer company where we turn all of that bread that would otherwise go to waste into really delicious beer, and then let's see if we can then turn all the profits from that beer into kind of even more good by funding food waste organizations in the UK, but also around the world. I was like, Tristram, mate, you had me at beer, so let's definitely, let's just go, let's dive in. And so the last couple of years have been just a really awesome journey, basically, ever since. And so, I mean, to give some, do people know how beer's made? Are people kind of familiar with the beer? Anyone homebrew here? No? Cool. So get homebrewing. We've open sourced our recipe, by the way, so you should go home and brew up our recipe. It's been downloaded 20,000 times now, so you won't be alone. You can go and brew up our mission. So basically, the way that beer is normally made, you would basically have malted barley and hot water in something called a mash tun, and you let that mix for around an hour, and then the water turns into a sugary liquid. All the sugars, the carbohydrates, the starch comes out of that malted barley, and you're left with a relatively flavoursome, malty, sugary liquid. You then move that liquid over to something called a kettle. It's called a kettle because you're going to boil it. You add hops, and the hops give it flavour and aroma. Lots of hops around here. They give it flavour and aroma. You then move that liquid over to a third tank called a fermenting tank, where you're going to add yeast, and then the yeast turns all those delicious sugars into alcohol. And so that's basically beer in a nutshell. And what we do is in that first tank where you've got your malted barley, we replace 1/3 of the malted barley with perfectly good fresh bread that would otherwise go to waste. And all of the sugars, the carbohydrates, the starch is basically extracted from that bread, and then the yeast will convert all of those sugars ultimately into delicious beer. So that's kind of the whole process in a nutshell. And so that's really what we kind of started doing kind of 2 years ago. And we started the business on 4 founding principles. And just first and foremost, like I said at the beginning, first and foremost, it's just freaking delicious. That has to be number one. So we're very lucky to have Like our first ever brew was filmed by Jamie Oliver. We've had people like Hugh Fearnley-Whittenstall kind of get involved and kind of support us. We're listed in like a few Michelin star restaurants, and we're just obviously unbiased, but like we're outstanding when it comes to just like quality and flavor, and like we packaged it up, I think, to look quite good and quite premium, and it's just all about a really great quality product, because we might be able to sell it on our relatively cuddly environmental principles, which I'll come to in a minute, but they're never going to come back. None of you would ever come back for a second or a third, maybe a fourth if you're feeling cheeky. You're just never going to come back for more if it's not really, really delicious. So that's number one. And then number two is we're trying to ultimately end bread waste in the beer industry. So we're trying to grow Toast to be as like significant a business as we can be. We're now national in the UK. We're selling in hundreds of independent bars and restaurants and pubs around the country, but also in Waitrose and Tesco's and Whole Foods and lots of great places. And we're also selling in the US. We're brewing and selling in the United States and in Brazil and South Africa and Iceland. And it's really growing crazily at the moment. And that's like part of the mission is just kind of grow the business, slice of bread in every bottle. More bottles that we sell, the more bread waste we're ultimately tackling. And we can have an impact directly ourselves that way. But we've also open sourced the recipe, the concept, like I said, and that's been downloaded 20,000 times. We're trying to shake up the industry by just saying, take this concept. This is where beer originated, and this is where we could take beer back to its roots to really tackle a fundamental issue in a really delicious way. And that's the kind of bigger mission, is to see if we can shift the entire beer industry. There is just no good reason why the whole beer industry, and we did some like back of a napkin calculations, and this is just pure fluke. This isn't our like master plan strategy. I wish it was, but it just turns out pretty nice, that if you did take all of the bread that goes to waste in the world and you replaced 1/3 of the malted barley with all of the beer that's produced in the world, it matches up almost exactly to like the decimal place. It's crazy. Like the tonnage is just exactly the same. And so if we can convince the whole beer industry to come on this journey with us, then we really could tackle one of the biggest like environmental issues of our time, which is food waste. And so that's kind of where we're really trying to start. So we get all of our bread from primarily the sandwich industry. So I always say, like, I'd love it if we had this, like, I'd love to offer you a romantic image of me on a pedal bike with a basket going from like artisanal bakery to artisanal bakery, collecting baguettes and like brewing them up. But the reality is that food waste and bread waste is happening at an industrial scale. So it's factories that are just churning out these products that are wasting it. And the sandwich industry is a classic example where the end slice, the heel of a loaf of bread, is surplus to requirements. It never ends up on your sandwich. And we are addicted to sandwiches in the UK, unlike any other country. We love our sandwiches. We eat millions of sandwiches every single day. And there are millions of crusts that go straight into landfill every single day all around this country. It's really crazy, like day fresh bread that just gets chucked. And by the time you eat your sandwich and it's gone through the supply chain, it will probably be bread that's like 2 days old, maybe 3 days old. If you buy it in a service station, it might be 4 days old. Still perfectly good to eat, but it's 4-day-old bread. What we'll do is we'll move that bread on the morning that it's been kind of baked and it's gone through the sort of sandwich factory and they've taken off the crust straight to the brewery, and we'll brew it up. So it can be day fresh bread that's been brewed. And yeah, the crazy thing about that from an economic perspective as well is that it's cheaper for the sandwich industry to give us the bread for free than it is for them to pay to dispose of that bread as commercial waste. They can't just fly tip the bread. They've got to pay someone to come and collect that bread. And so it's actually cheaper for them just to deliver it to us on their kind of standard delivery route. They now just stick a load of like excess bags of bread into their delivery trucks and then drop it at the brewery and give it to us to brew up. So our second principle, we're going to end bread waste through beer. Third thing is trying to raise awareness about food waste. So some of these facts and stats, 44% of bread, 1/3 of the food in the world, 1 billion tons. Hopefully some of that stuff is like settling in. But we're trying to do that in a way that's not preachy. We're not trying to be holier than thou. We're not trying to kind of ram it down people's throats. It's about just saying these are massive issues, and let's try and address them and talk about them and solve them, but raise awareness in what we believe is a quite palatable way and a slightly more accessible way than maybe other techniques. And you need lots of different techniques to basically ultimately reach everyone, and some people will react better to a slightly more kind of aggressive campaigning approach. We believe our technique works really well for a lot of consumers and a lot of members of the public, just to kind of more subtly kind of come to the understanding once you've bought a really delicious beer and then you find out, oh wow, this beer's actually been made with bread that would go to waste, and oh, I didn't know that like 44% of the bread that's baked goes to waste. So it's trying to communicate those things in a very accessible way. And then the fourth thing about our business is we are ultimately trying to pour like all of our profits, so 100% of our profits, into charity. So we're a regular business, like we're not totally regular, I guess, but we are a regular business. We're profit motivated. We're not a charity. We are 100% a business, and we have shareholders. So shareholders have invested in Toast to help us grow the business, but our shareholders are happy that any distributable profits, any dividends, will ultimately be given to charity. So they're never going to receive dividends from their investment. The only way they'll ever realize a return is if they ever then sell their shares to somebody else who wants to buy their shares, or if the business was to ever have a commercial value to somebody wanting to purchase a part of the business, perhaps. And so we're kind of, basically we've called that principle equity for good, where people are happy to sort of invest in a business for a lot of the environmental and social returns that you're getting. And so that's our kind of fourth principle. And like I said, kind of so far, so good. And the business is really growing and scaling on that basis. And so I mentioned sort of the UK model, our sort of, and then our international growth, the way that we're growing globally, has really happened through a couple of different models and sort of business approaches. So one is we started in the US just under our own business operations. We set up a business in New York that's 100% owned by the UK business as a subsidiary, and then we brew and distribute locally in the US. And the reason for that, so financially it would probably make more sense just to produce more beer here and then export that around the world. The cost of transportation would not be so much that it wouldn't just justify doing that. So a lot of typical breweries would just increase their production and export. But for us, that defeats the whole environmental principle behind what we're trying to do. Food waste is one of the biggest problems because it contributes towards environmental catastrophe and climate change. Like the food industry is by far the biggest contributor towards greenhouse gas emissions. So you would typically associate the airline industry or the oil industry as the kind of big culprits towards environmental disaster. The reality is that it's the food industry that's using a lot of the energy that we're producing, that's cutting down rainforests, that's using the aircraft. We're all got to eat. There's billions of us on this planet, and it's the food industry that's causing a huge amount of the environmental impact. And obviously, when 1/3 goes to waste, you realise why that is just absolute sort of bonkers. And so for us to kind of then export our beer would just make no sense. So we're now doing that sort of local production, local bread waste, local kind of distribution, and getting people to really understand and buy into the fact that you could have a global business. So the Toast brand is kind of growing internationally and globally, but we're also trying to root it in what we believe is also modern day kind of consumer demand of local craft. You know where it's brewed. You probably go past where it's been brewed. You'd understand it. You'd relate to it. It's not going to be this random town in the UK. If you're in the US, you'd understand where it's been brewed in the US. And so we're trying to kind of do that. So we then also have franchised the concept. And so we've licensed the rights to brew and distribute Toast to a brewery in Cape Town, to a brewery in Rio, to a brewery in Reykjavik. Reykjavik's pretty random. Iceland is not a massive market, but it was a good opportunity for us. And then in the next 3 years, we'll be, I've got no doubt, it's bold, but I've got no doubt that we'll be like selling toast in 30 to 40 countries around the world. We get demand every single day, like just not exaggerating, every single day from breweries, bakeries, food waste entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs in general, all around the world who have heard about what we've done and want to bring toast to their market somehow. And so we're trying to work out, okay, how can we make that work? There's no one-size-fits-all model. So we're licensing, we're franchising. We've got some models where we're going to be setting up our own business. We're also setting up this platform, which is going to be, we haven't quite worked it out yet what it will be called, but something like a sort of a toast certified approach where we intend to connect every single bakery, every brewery, every food waste organization in the world so that this can all just happen without us. It takes that sort of open sourced recipe to the next level, where you won't just be able to download the recipe, you'll be able to download a lot of the sort of step-by-step process as to how you would connect all the dots and make this happen. So that's kind of the business and the business model and the world domination master plan. And behind it all is our kind of mission statement and our brand kind of statement. And so our mission statement is that if you want to change the world, you've got to throw a better party than the people destroying it. And that for us underpins so much of who we are, what we are. It's about throwing great parties, having a great time, not trying to be too righteous, basically not being righteous at all, I hope. But doing it in a way that's obviously like commercially sustainable, is environmentally sustainable, is promoting drinking responsibly as well. We say bread shouldn't be wasted and neither should you, so like drink responsibly. And that's the joy of kind of craft beer, is that you're drinking a really quality product that isn't about knocking back kind of 6 or 7. You can have 2 or 3 and you shouldn't be like over consuming it. And you can also make a really good like impact and difference at the same time as enjoying a delicious product. So yeah, I think that kind of on the whole like captures our story. Like for me to kind of conclude and give a couple of shameless plugs, I would say like we're kind of recruiting at the moment. So we're expanding really quickly. I know I'm speaking to a room of entrepreneurs, so it might be the wrong group directly yourselves. But if you know anyone that's looking for interesting work, like we're hiring a finance director, a global expansion director, an events and branding manager, like sales staff all across the country, a new brewer, if you fancy taking home brewing to the next level. So we're growing very quickly at the moment in both the UK and New York. And then my final plug is if you want to buy the beer, you should go to toastale.com. And if you put in, I've got a discount code you could use actually. So if you put I know Rob, now that we're all Bezzy mates. So if you put I know Rob, you'll get a 10% discount code as well at like checkout. And hopefully that will help encourage you, but also just go down to your local Waitrose or Tesco's, or kind of, there'll be lots of other awesome independent beer shops that you can go and buy this in as well. So thank you very much.